measures and perhaps some water saving features for your customers. Um, Michelle's going to be running the slides for me today as I haven't got mine all set up. So next slide, please, Michelle. So as Dan pointed out, I'm president of IWAC and also the water department director for the city of Coeur d'Alene. With me today is Jay Adams, who is the vice president of IWAC and the general manager of Liberty Lake Sewer and Water District. I'll be doing a short introduction to IWAC, and then I'm going to hand it off to Jay to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of what the efficient irrigation standards are and kind of wrap up together why we think this is important to our region, especially over the SVRP. So, next slide, please. Our objectives today are to educate purveyors and operators on the goals of the projects that IWAC has been moving forward with. We have focused on education to help promote resources for public water and wastewater systems that are members and non-members of our system, but are in our region over the SVRP or the Spokane Valley Rafter and Prairie Aquifer. And we have been utilizing different mediums to spread the word. As Dan pointed out, we have, Jay and I've been doing kind of a short roadshow before COVID hit to councils and boards to kind of introduce them to the standards. By the way, I just wanted to make a note that Mr. Kegley is the past president of IWAC, and I succeeded him trying to fill those shoes, and wow, he got some big feet. So we also like to provide detailed information about the mechanics of irrigation efficiency and how you can help change that. So next slide, please. The purpose of IWAC was to promote bi-state protection of our sole source aquifer through educational resources. As you well know, North Idaho and Eastern Washington and Spokane Valley share a sole source aquifer, the Spokane Valley Rafter and Prairie Aquifer. And for years, we've been discussing, water rights and in-river, in-stream flow rates. And so we decided to get together and rather than have to deal through the courts with this, try to work on this collaboratively to provide education for protection and enhancement of those resources. There are currently 19 water and wastewater members of IWAC, and we are always looking for new members. The board members are equally divided between Idaho and Washington. Next slide, please. Kind of a short overview of our projects. Our overall goal is for water quality and quantity preservation. We've put together some source water protection videos in collaboration with KSPS as well as a couple other mediums. And we have recently drafted efficient irrigation and landscape design guidelines, which Jay will be talking more in depth about and give you the reasons and goals for the guidelines. Jay was a driving factor in getting these completed and accurate as possible. So I really have to hand it to him for all his guidance in that. One of the fun projects we had was Drippy the Water Drop, and we'll kind of go over that here in the next couple slides. So next slide, please. So for water quality and quantity, we had to identify large-scale points of pollution that we could try to drive some educational outreach about. As we are not a regulatory agency or anything like that, we are a nonprofit organization. We focused on educational outreach to the public, water purveyors, elected and appointed officials, councils, boards, and whatnot. As I mentioned, we had to identify our target audience. Today, we're looking at you folks. How can you help get the word out? We like to produce and promote good conservation measures. Next slide, please. So here's kind of and mine froze up here, lovely. I'm running a dual slide here to get my notes. So here's some of the videos we have done. We have a series of aquifer challenge questions that were run on KSPS, public television, as well as other mediums. They're also available on the IOWAC website. You can have a look at those. You're just kind of fun, cute little 30-second videos that kind of challenge your mind on what you can do to protect your water supplies. There are some good videos on how the aquifer functions. Then we've also recently had Mr. Kegley do some backflow prevention videos for IWAC, and I think he did some for SAGB as well. So, next slide, please. As mentioned, our goal today is to talk about the model efficient irrigation and landscape design guidelines. We selected went out and selected a consultant to review information from other states across the country that are having water quality and water conservation issues, such as California, Arizona, Florida, and to develop some of those standards for our region. Why is that? Well, we don't want to end up like those areas in the future. Right now, we have water that we can protect. Those areas thought they did too, and look at the position they're in now. And as I mentioned earlier, we had a Wazoo student draft some Drippy the Water Drop coloring cards for use in schools and for kids for learning programs. It kind of takes Drippy through the hydrologic cycle and teaches students about that. So we have distributed that to many of the school districts in the area. Next slide, please. So with the efficient irrigation landscape design, guidelines, again, who was our target audience? We were looking primarily towards water purveyors, elected and appointed officials of public water systems or cities that employ public water systems, boards, councils, commissioners, and so on. What was the objective? Well, one of the issues we've run into, and one that Bajay will point out to you and discuss, is that there is a serious lack of codes in relation to irrigation systems. Most cities have very little requirement for any large-scale planning for design of irrigation systems, and there is an inefficiency to that is causing problems within our region. How can this help? It'll help drive water conservation. When you get into potential cost, it may cost a little bit more upfront to design more efficient systems, but in the long run, you're going to see a reduction in the overall water usage and a reduction in cost for your customers, as well as less pumping infrastructure in the future. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it over to Bajay, and he'll get into the mechanics of the efficient irrigation standards.
Thanks, Terry. I'll start share my screen. All right, can you see it? Excellent. All right, so just a little bit of background about efficient irrigation systems and irrigation in general. Landscape irrigation is the single largest use of potable water in the United States. In fact, that's 70% of the water use that we deliver to our customers is used outdoors. And of that, 50% of the water used for irrigation is wasted from things like evaporation, wind, and overwatering from inefficient systems. We believe through education planning, it's estimated that landscapes can be maintained using 30 to 50% water. And I can provide examples of those for private programs that we did here at Liberty Lake Sewer and Water District. So what I've done is I went to Google Earth and in particular, the Google Earth images from August of 2011. And I took just randomly took photos from public facilities across the SVRP aquifer, ranging from Athol to Spokane. This one here is from Athol Elementary, and you could see on the playground areas and ball field areas these very distinct donuts, green donuts. And these are primarily, well, there's a number of reasons that cause these green donuts, but primarily from inefficient design or inefficient use of heads. Ideally, you want heads to spray head to head so you don't end up having these green donuts with dry spots intermits between the donuts, because what you ended up doing is, what water managers will do is just go out and crank up the clock timer to try to keep those dry spots green. And irregardless of how much you punch the up button on that clock timer, if your system is incapable of reaching those dry areas, you're not going to get green. So just some very illustrative examples of what we see here. Plugging of heads can also, or pressure issues can also contribute to these green donut features. This one's from Betty Kiefer Elementary in Rathdrum. Although to a lesser degree that you saw at Athol Elementary, there's still some, and there's some pretty unique features at the top center photo of this, where they're not green donuts, but kind of more oblong type shapes. Those might be other, just system inefficiencies with regards to plugged heads or broken heads, etc. You can still see a fair amount of the green donuts and dry spots throughout this landscape. This one's Dalton Elementary School. You can see their ball field, a lot of the same things that you saw in the other two images. Woodland Middle School in Coeur d'Alene. Some of these are more, instead of green donuts, are more like brown donuts, because you see just a little green dot in the center where the head is located, and then a bunch of dry grass, and then there's a green donut on a much further distance away, and a lot of that is attributed to just the breakup pattern of the spray head, where you're not having that, it's kind of squirting out like a stream as opposed to a pattern that's all broken up. And you can even see it, and this isn't all just limited to large landscape areas. You can see it in the small little areas out by the parking lot, up against the school. You can see dry spots in there as well. So it's just not, and you can even see on adjacent neighborhoods that they have some, but it's just not as obvious, but it's definitely present. Highlands Golf Course in Post Falls. You could see a lot of unique features there, heads that may be broken, creating these, linear features or teardrop type features, as well as green and brown donuts. Spokane County Sheriff's Training Center in Newman Lake. There's some portions of their system that are completely dry. Other portions that have pretty decent efficiency kind of in the top center. And then as you get out in the middle portion of that landscape, kind of more of that green donut type patterns. Liberty Lake Elementary School in Liberty Lake, same thing. And even in their small landscape areas in the top center of the photograph, you could see are completely brown, or even the really small one adjacent to the school is totally brown, or along the eastern edge. There's a number of brown spots and long linear green spots, and then that green and brown donuts you see there across their playground area. Valley Christian School in Spokane Valley. It's this one in particular just finished irrigating at the time of the photograph, so you can see that as evidenced by the wet spot in the ball field diamond, and both of those, in fact. And so, but still, nonetheless, you see these green donut and also other very brown features. Whitman Elementary School in Spokane. You see this landscape's got very good efficiency in the bottom left-hand corner, kind of moderate efficiency in the bottom right-hand corner, but in the center up by the the Red Roof School is just totally brown. So I don't know if those zones are just not working, or, you know, in particular between that and the parking lot, there's, you know, half of it's working with green and brown donuts and the other half's totally dead. So these are kind of some of the things that we're talking about in terms of not just system inefficiency and design, but also just system maintenance and upkeep. So what are some of just efficiencies from design? Some of these I'd already pointed out in the photographs, but proper head spacing, ideally they're designed to be placed so they spray head to head and in proper distances with those, as well as head selection. You know, you want to put heads where they're not going to get blocked by, and this isn't always possible, but you don't want them to get blocked by fences, light posts, etc. Proper head height can contribute to some of these brown and green donuts. If you're not got the proper head height and they're buried down, you're going to see that very distinct green close to the head, but then you're going to see like that space of brown before it gets to the green part of the donut. Proper head application. So you don't, I mean, it seems intuitive, but I see it all the time where you have a 15-foot spray head in a 6-foot space and it just oversprays the area that's needed. Typically people break a head, they just go to Home Depot, grab one that looks like it off the shelf and don't realize that they're actually designed to spray a certain distance. So they're going to select a long, you know, a larger or shorter spray for that distance. Improper nozzle applications, whether you're using fine mist, large droplets, or a breakup. Like I had mentioned earlier, you know, if you don't have that breakup, it's just going to spray out of there like a stream and not get broke up and get to the landscape at all. Match precipitation rates is important. You want to, anytime you want to design or have a system, you want to use the same type of material, same brand. If you're going to go with Toro, stick with Toro. And a lot of if you stick with the same brands, whether you're using a corner or a 90-degree or a 180 or 360, any of those, make sure you have matched precipitation rates for that area that you're covering. That plays into the mismatched heads. You don't want to put a Rainbird in a Toro system or a Hunter system, that kind of stuff. You want to stay with the same type of head throughout, in particular throughout the zone, if not ideally throughout the landscape. You want to separate your zones as well. You don't want spray heads mixed with large rotors. You don't want large rotors mixed with drip irrigation. All those zones need to be separated. You want to make sure that you have system pressures adequate to design the system. These heads are designed to operate at a certain pressure. Most of the times that's around 40 psi. So if you have your system's got 80 psi or heads that are designed to operate at 40, you're obviously going to have too much pressure and a lot of misting. And then vice versa. If you have a low pressure system, the heads will barely pop up, barely spray out to their design capacity. That's really important for proper distribution. Pipe size is more of a volume issue there. I probably don't need to preach it to this group. And then also plant water requirements. You want to make sure that you're selecting heads that are ideal for the plants that you're trying to water, whether it's turf or trees or gardens or, you know, shrub beds. Slope drainage and landscape contours are always something to keep in mind. I got some photos later in my presentation to outline how slope and contours contribute to runoff if you're not diligent about your zone time settings. Soil type, compacted soils, root zone depth. It's not a mystery that all of our new developments are stripped of topsoil, not topsoil is sold, and so we're left with the valley gravels that have been compacted with all the big heavy machinery running around building homes. And so, you know, it makes it difficult for grass to establish a good root zone depth, which is important for storage and volume of water, so you don't have to water so much. Installation practices, obviously you want to keep your sprinklers and your screens associated with keeping those free of debris when you're installing this equipment. And then also backflow devices installed that we see quite frequently. They're installed on the wrong side of the blowout or not at all. So the maintenance inefficiencies, some of these kind of play into the other ones I just talked about, but misdirected spray, you're spraying it where it's not intended to, so you're not maintaining the, you know, the degree of arc that you want on that spray, whether it's, you know, if you only want it to spray 90 degrees and it ends up spraying 180, well, that's misdirected spray. Broken risers and heads, leaking seals on some of the sprinkler heads will really contribute to loss of volume to get the water out where you need it to. Plug nozzles and screens, like I said, block spray, tilted heads. Like a lot of times mowers will hit heads and tilt them either forward or backward. That's not going to get you the proper angle in order to achieve that head-to-head spraying that you intend. Head height I'd mentioned previously. And then a lot of the inefficiencies that we see with regards to maintenance is we promote nighttime watering. Well, that's awesome, and that's what we should be promoting, but you also need to check your system regularly, because if it were running at 10 in the morning every day, you would probably see it running and you would be able to catch some of these maintenance inefficiencies. But the fact that we have it set at night, you don't see it. So it's really important that you check it periodically and run it for a minute per zone to make sure that you see that, you know, these inefficiencies, you didn't hit it with a mower and tilt the head or break the head. A lot of time they're not caught until they see a big, you know, homeowner sees a big brown spot and like, why is that brown? Well, you got a broken head and it's been, you know, broken for a month or more. So, and then also there's inefficiencies with regards to system operation. Set proper scheduling. Typically what we see is people water in a box. And what I mean by that is you started in April and you end it in October and you don't ever touch the timer. So, you know, you're kind of watering in that box, you never change it. Plant water requirements aren't like a box. There's not a lot of plant water requirement. The plant doesn't need a lot of water in April. It needs a lot of water in July. And plants also don't need a lot of water in October. So you really need to water more along a bell curve as opposed to in a box. Start time is important. Obviously, you don't want to be running these systems in the heat of the day. Ideally, early morning, late evening, at night are ideal run start times. Run times are important, in particular if you can cycle soak. And so if you want to get 30 minutes on a zone, for instance, don't just run that zone for 30 minutes because you're going to just get saturation and it's going to run off. You want to break that into cycle soak programs so you can do it into, you know, two run times of 15 minutes each on that zone, if that's what you want to get 30 minutes. That way it has a chance to get water and then soak into the roots, and then you apply a little bit more water. That's important to storage of the water in for the plant's use, as opposed to irrigating that area for a great length of time, then it just goes past the root zone depth and soaks into the ground. Mow height, the longer you keep it, the more that volume of storage you're going to keep and maintain. I mean, it's not always idealistic, but we don't need to have our lawns look like, you know, putting greens either, right? So if you keep the grass clippings on your lawn, it actually substitutes as a fertilization once a year. So grass clippings are important. It also recycles nutrients that helps promote growth and keeps the grass green. So removal of grass clippings is not ideal. And then we see this all the time in Liberty Lake too. There's a lot of new development going on, and a customer will come to us and say, wow, you know, man, your water rates are really expensive, and I've been using a ton of water, and we start looking at the water they use and we say, wow, you've been using a ton of water. You must have a leak. We go out and pay a visit to the customer and find out that they've lived in the house for 3 years and they still have their landscape set for new turf settings. It's like, yeah, you're using a lot of unnecessary water and you're paying a lot more than you need to. So be cognizant of that as well. I've seen that quite a bit. Rain delays, there's a number of sensors out there that will interrupt the clock timer if it rains or get some rain throughout the time. And then also there's a host of sensor-based technologies, whether they're soil sensors or kind of a more of a meteorologic station sensors. So they're out there as well. So promote the use of those. So the next few slides are just kind of illustrating some of my points. Yeah, I think this misdirected spray, we're not intending to grow grass in the middle of the street. Or maybe this is a run zone issue. I think they probably have definitely enough water on this particular piece of landscape. They don't need to be irrigating. Here's an example of the slope runoff where you could be having run zone times. Oh, I'll let everybody I'll pause here and let the questions. Good to continue? Okay, so this is an example, kind of more topography and how if you're not cycle soaking or running over, having long run times, you're going to have runoff issues that are going to just leave the landscape. Here's another excellent illustration. This is in Liberty Lake up on Legacy Ridge when they were first built in 2006, where they were irrigating these landscapes and had significant runoff of landscapes from over irrigation. Broken heads that are either caught or ignored, that ended up running all the way down the parking lot and into the stormwater swale on the other side of the parking lot. Cars are parked on top of it, dripping oil. That water carries the oil, just like stormwater. So these are things to do. Make sure that landscape managers need to correct these inefficiencies. So I want to highlight this importance of this term called distribution uniformity. And distribution uniformity is thought of just kind of like a percentage of, kind of like a grade percentage if you were going to get one in class. And a system, and I'm just going to say a system that is, most systems are typically right around, and it's pretty poor, but it's truth, is about 50% of distribution uniformity. So what does that really mean is if your plant, i.e. your turf, we promote this 1 inch of water a week type of education that's been out on the books for decades. But if you say we want 1 inch of water a week on our landscape and your system is only 50% efficient, well, you're going to have to irrigate that landscape and get 2 inches of water on that landscape in order to meet that requirement. And so, like I said, it's pretty common that distribution uniformity is 50%, but we ideally should be designing systems that are in the excellent to good range. But that doesn't mean just because the system is designed improperly to begin with, that there aren't things that you can do to make retrofits to improve the distribution uniformity. And I'll go through some examples of that. But the way the distribution uniformity is measured is basically you perform an irrigation audit on the landscape, and you place cups at and between all of the irrigation heads across the landscape. And then you run the zone for a period of time, and then you measure the volume of water that is captured in these cups. And then you put that into a spreadsheet and you end up calculating distribution uniformity across that landscape. So you might have some cups, i.e. like the one in front of my wheel, that might have a lower volume, but you might have some that are behind me there that are going to have a much higher volume. And so across that landscape, that kind of gives you, ideally, you want to have a very uniform volume across that landscape and not have these highs and low volumes. So the more uniform volume that is captured in those cups, the higher distribution uniformity you end up achieving. And so you run it as it's a picture just showing it in operation, and then you go through and record all the volumes in these cups. But there's different types of head have different efficiencies as well. Obviously, the most efficient type of irrigation system is a subsurface drip irrigation system. Those are 90% efficient. We also have like micro irrigation systems that are 85% that have little drip emitters on them. Those are pretty common. You send this little drip emitter to the shrub that you want to water, etc. Then you have large rotors are next, 70% efficient. That's why you see the golf courses are very high distribution uniformity, because they're properly designed and they're using large rotors. Small rotors are 65% efficient, and these little pop-up spray heads are 50% efficient. And spray heads, they have retrofits like the ones to the photo to the right, and I'll show you an example of that. And those are called an MP rotator. And they're just a little tiny rotor that is retrofitted to a spray head body. And they act more like a small rotor, where they're between a small and large rotor, where you're going to get maximum amount of efficiency out of these heads. So your traditional spray head, everybody's seen these. They're very susceptible to wind drift. If you have pressure issues, they really will just spray a lot of volume of water out in a hurry. The range of flow from individual spray head goes from about 0.1 gallon per minute to just about 5.5 gallons per minute. That's per head. That's a lot of water that can be put out. The MP rotators are running anywhere from 0.17 to 1 gallon per minute. And so it's pretty easy to do the math on this. And so as an example, if you have traditional spray heads that are about, let's say, 1.85 gallons per minute, and this is an actual example. These are actual spray heads that I got from the Hunter's website. So if you have a spray head that's producing 1.85 gallon per minute and you're running that spray head for 20 minutes, that individual spray head is going to put out 37 gallons. Now, if you retrofit that to an MP rotator that is producing 0.5 gallon a minute, and you run that same zone, that same spray head for 20 minutes, then you're only putting out 10 gallons per minute. That's a 73% reduction in just one single head. So you can see what kind of reduction you're going to get across the landscape. The other important thing behind these little MP rotators is they have a pretty slow precipitation rate. And what that causes is that you don't end up losing pressure throughout the zone. And because of that, allows you to put more heads on that zone, as well as your valving, and you can improve your layout. So the design using traditional spray heads on the left, you can see there's a lot more spray heads that are out there. And if these are producing 1.85 gallons a minute across that landscape, that's a whole lot of water that's being applied. But if you start from scratch and you design using MP rotators, then you could see you have a whole lot less number of heads, which is not only important from a water conservation standpoint, but it's also important in the customer's pocketbook, because you don't have to buy so many heads, and you don't have to have as much piping and as much control valves, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on. And then you're improving distribution uniformity as well. So there's lots of money to be saved in designing systems right from the start, or even retrofitting systems that are already designed. And I'm going to go into that next. So I'm going to provide some examples of what we did at Liberty Lake. And some of these are a bit dated, but they're all very relevant. So this image was taken in the same month from Google Earth of August of 2011. The same landscape photos that I showed you across the SDRP aquifer. And you could see that we have pretty decent distribution uniformity across our landscape. So we have about 2.5 acres. I audited our system in 2005. And when I audited it, our system efficiency was 44%. So we decided to implement some landscape measures. We found that we had excessive pressure. So we put little pressure reducing devices on our valves. We matched and aligned all of our rotor heads. And by matched, I mean, we had a hodgepodge of all kinds of different heads. I had Toro, I had Rainbird, et cetera, et cetera. So I went through and put all the same heads in. And then we installed a soil sensor. So I didn't go in and dig up the whole landscape and lay new pipe. But the cost of this was about $500. And just from these retrofits, we reduced our water by 36% the next year, and we improved our distribution formula to 61 by just making those simple improvements. Next thing that we did was our swale along the north side of our parking lot. We had 22 spray heads there. We converted those into MP rotators, MP 2000s. Each spray head was doing 2.66 gallons per minute. That was an actual from the spray head that we took out and the model that was used. The MP 2000s were producing 0.71 gallons per minute. So we saved 42.9 gallons every minute that system ran. Every minute that zone ran, we saved about 43 gallons. And that was in 2005. And then the next thing that we did was we addressed the swale out by the road in front of our property. There were 61 spray heads there. Because we used the MP 1000 rotators, we were able to remove 27 of those spray heads. It goes back to that design that I showed you where you can actually have less heads because using the MP rotators. So we were able to remove 27 of those. So the ones that were left, they were producing 1.85 gallons a minute, just like the swale on the north side of our parking lot. We put the MP 1000s in at a half a gallon per minute, and those changes had recognized savings of 95.85 gallons per minute every minute that system ran. And you can see that, you know, it's very effective, and we have very good distribution uniformity, and we were able to achieve a lot of water savings. And so this is the concepts that I had presented to IWAC and IWAC's initiative to move forward with a design efficiency guidebook. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm not sure if you want to do questions now or later.
So Dan has a question for you.
Yeah. If Dan can unmute. So, you talked a lot about water resources, and of course my internet connection is telling me it's unstable. So hopefully I'll get this out. Can you talk a little bit, Jay, about how the standards help with water quality?
With water quality?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, it plays into a little bit of, some of that runoff and things like that I talked about with cars, being parked on there, that is contributing to stormwater runoff and additional pollutants. And if you just fertilized your lawn, then it's going to carry additional fertilization along with it. So a lot of it is related, and obviously a lot of people, when they do fertilize their lawn, over fertilize on the sidewalks and the parking lot. And so if you have overspray, it can bring that into wash that fertilizer off into places that you don't want, those kinds of things.
Excellent. Any other questions? You just type them into the chat function.
All right, thank you, Jay. That was very informative on that portion of it, and very well laid out. So we're back to my portion of it, and again, we've talked about a target audience, and today we're highlighting the purveyors and operators. And I'm sure you all have the question, well, why me? What does that have to do with me? Oh, Michelle's getting ahead of me. So, well, yes, you're in the business of selling water, but there's also something called water efficiency standards that we all have to live by, as well as the water purveyors can drive some of these codes, ordinances, and standards to help push some more efficient guidelines out to the installers and designers for this type of system. Next slide, please. IWAC in our portion of it, and I saw a question pop up about whether the efficient irrigation standards could be supplied to all of you guys. Yes, they're available on our website, and we can also send you out a PDF of them very easily. We've been doing that. We recently mailed out nearly 400 guides to public utilities, and you probably have some in your systems, elected and appointed officials, city councils, boards, planning groups, DOH, DEQ, and others. In that, we included a letter that suggested an initial goal for the region of a 30% reduction in our peak use. We mean, the peak summertime use, and we'll cover that in a couple slides later on. So a 30% goal, we think, is fairly easy to do just by increasing the efficiency standards alone. So next slide, please. So what should you be using? And Bijay pointed out some of the overwatering of it. So here's a little simple math question for you. 1 acre foot of water equals 326,000 gallons. As any of you have taken your operator test, you should know that. So if you divide that by 12 inches, 1 acre inch of water per week is what's recommended for turf, equals about 27,166 gallons. However, many irrigation systems are only 30 to 40% efficient. So this means you are likely using 3 times as much water to achieve that 1 inch of water per week. So if you take that, you're applying 82,000 gallons per acre just to meet what you have to have, the 27,166 gallons. So just a little math to kind of get you an idea of what's going on there, and something you can actually show it to your customers if you wanted to. Next slide, please. And you always hear the complaint, but we have plenty of water. The SVRP is a very prolific aquifer, and so why are we worrying about this? Well, so did Arizona, California, Florida. They all had plenty of water when they started, but they're seeing, immense population growth as we're starting to see in our area, and now look where they are. But the big thing is a matter of conservation. The water rates here are so inexpensive, there's no incentive to conserve. So we need to look at ways to mitigate that. And as the regions continue to grow, the increased demand will drive additional infrastructure requirements, which is getting very expensive to do. And that will further increase the demand on our SVRP aquifer. We think it's simply not sustainable to do this. We need to think about the future now. So we've been working on efforts to significantly reduce what's used now to provide for future growth. Next slide, please. So here's a graph we found a while back on water usage across the SVRP. This is back in 2015. As you can see, you have your winter time where it's fairly flat. January, February, March, April begins the irrigation season. And so you see a bell curve in irrigation usage over the summer. And as Bijay pointed out, even though we may see a bell curve, depending on when systems come online, many people water in a box, meaning that they were setting their watering systems for the August need and just left it at that, turned it off at the end of the season. Well, in April, they turn it back on, and they never adjust that. So they're watering at that peak summer requirement, and the turf or flowers, trees, whatever, does not need it at that time. They're not adjusting their timers. So next slide, please. I happened upon this graph a few weeks ago. This is projected growth across USFRP from 2010 to 2040. And as you'll notice, the red or maroon in that is consumptive use, and the blues are non-consumptive use. Look how much they're expected to grow in summertime over the next 20 years. That's, as I pointed out, that's simply not sustainable. We need to be cognizant of what's going on there and see what we can do to protect that supply for beyond 2040. Next slide, please. So here's a graph we put together, kind of looking at what if we could achieve a 30% reduction. So here you can see in blue what's been used against in Spokane County itself, and 30% reduction would be in red. If you figure that out, City of Coeur d'Alene uses about 4.4 billion gallons a year. The savings in this over one summer cycle could supply the city of Coeur d'Alene for 3 years. That's a significant amount of water that we could reduce and save. So, next slide, please. We all have this issue where we're working with plan development. Most of our planning requirements, planning and zoning requires a certain percentage of green space, typically around 10%. Well, unfortunately, turf is the least expensive and easiest to maintain for developers to install. So there's not really any incentive for them to do anything more efficient and less water hungry. So this is what we're seeing. So we've got to devise a way to look at reducing turf. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, green space development standards. How many jurisdictions actually require detailed irrigation and landscape design plans? As we were doing a little bit of research on that, very few. A lot of them require for commercial, but none for residential, and residential makes up the majority of our overall water use. Next slide, please. What are our expectations? No, we don't want desert. You know, we like our green space. Our water is relatively inexpensive, but we need to look at methods to conserve. So there are other options, more efficient irrigation systems, as BJ pointed out, especially with the NP rotators, and more efficient landscapes. We'll talk about xeriscape and native landscaping in a moment here. Next slide, please. We need to change the culture. We need to think about efficiency and sustainability long-term over our aquifer. And we as water purveyors and operators, that's our job. You know, we need to promote that. So that's kind of why we're here today, to talk to you folks about that, to get you on board and start changing that culture. Next slide, please. BJ talked a little bit about design considerations, maybe establishing a minimum 70% efficiency requirement for irrigation systems. Consider a minimum percentage of low water use landscapes for new developments or retrofitted developments. We should be looking at requiring certifications for design, installation, and maintenance. A lot of the residential systems are installed by high school kids hired by irrigation contractors, and they have no concept of what they're doing other than he tells them, pencils out something, and sends them out there to install it. So, next slide, please. Repairs and upgrades. Upgrades do not have to cost a fortune, as BJ mentioned. You may be able to reduce the number of heads by installing the new MP rotators, and they can be relatively quick and easy and inexpensive to do, and it will drastically improve your water efficiency and probably cost you less water in the long run. Next slide, please. As BJ pointed out, proper annual maintenance. Simple adjustments can have a significant effect on your irrigation performance, specifically by not watering the sidewalks or the street, watering only the grass areas, and making sure that everything's working and not broken heads and stuff like that. So next slide, please. Repair leaks immediately. Routinely check for clogged and worn, damaged heads. Check for correct pressure. And BJ talked a little bit about this. Too much pressure is just as bad as not enough pressure on these. They're designed to run in a certain pressure range. But what happens with the consumer that they have too many heads on his own, so it's not watering properly? What do? They add a booster pump and increase that pressure. Increasing that pressure increases atomization of the water, providing water that can be easily carried off by the rain or wind. So adjust cycle seasonally and use the same type replacement heads. Next slide, please. Consider taller grass heights. Ever walk out in the field in the summer of tall grass and your feet still get wet? Well, the taller the grass, the more it retains that water near the surface. So consider that. Make sure you prune shrubs and trees to allow better spray patterns. BJ mentioned the problems with runoff on slopes, so frequent shorter duration cycles help with that. I fight with Winco over here because we have a river running down the street in the summer from all of their slopes. Match heads to local conditions and test that backflow assembly annually. Make sure it functions properly. Perform proper spring, startup, and fall winterization procedures. Next slide, please. I just kind of threw this one in for fun, just kind of show you what depth requirements are. Turf generally requires a water depth of 12 inches to remain healthy, whereas plants and shrubs require 18 inches and trees require 24 inches. Well, when the systems are laid out, they're usually laid out for one type of vegetation. They're not usually designed to water for mixed vegetation purposes. So that's another thing to look at in your design considerations.
Hey,
Next slide.
Terry,
Yes.
I might mention here on a lot of the audits that I perform, turf grass and residential lawns are often the root zone depth hardly ever exceeds 4 inches. And so, yeah, this is a very important consideration, because if you have a very shallow root zone depth, because you're not stressing that plant out to send its roots any deeper, and then, you know, you're watering 12 inches, all that other water below that's wasted.
All right, thank you, Jay. Yes, that's a very good point. So next slide, please. Looks like we're running short on time, so we'll get what we can. Next slide, Michelle. Okay. Jay pointed out the drip irrigation systems are highly efficient and fairly easy to install. Next slide, please. Xeriscape. So this is another alternative method to water hungry turf. So this utilizes drought tolerant plantings and ground coverings in lieu of turf that require little to almost no water. So you could utilize this in a mixed vegetation setup to create a very attractive landscape. And a lot of the local colleges even have xeriscaping classes that are available to the public. Next slide, please. Here's another example of a xeriscape garden. Typically, they cost around $1.50 to $2.50 per square foot to install, but require significantly less water. Next slide. You can also look at rock gardens. They can provide an attractive alternative to which use little or no water. Next slide, please. Here's an example of natural landscape methods using native species to create a rather attractive, very low maintenance landscaping. Next slide. You want to use drought tolerant native plant species, and there's a good list of those through many of the colleges in the area, as well as your native or your local florists. Next one, please. Some of our systems deal with agricultural use, and some of our outlying areas see this across the SVRP. So there's methods available for irrigation on farms. Next, please. Want to just kind of spotlight, if we have time, to cover a couple of things for the area. Spokane has a Spokanescape program where they're granting credit to customers for removing of turf and installing low water use landscaping. Let's move on to a couple slides down, Michelle, for let's go. Yeah, okay. So here's a kind of example, a graph from the Spokanescape and water savings back in 2018, I believe, or 19. And so in the green, you can see water usage savings over the period of time and what it's growing to. We haven't seen any graph for 2020 yet, but I'm sure it's probably significantly more than that. And I think they have a very successful program there. Next one, please. On the Palouse, not on our aquifer, but on the Grand Ronde aquifer, Moscow and Pullman collaboratively worked together on a program called Yscape, where they have produced a water efficiency landscape design for their area, granting credits to their neighbors. And move on, please. Next slide. Next slide. So this is kind of a show of their demo garden at the Moscow Water Department, where they had a kind of a sparse grass landscaping around there that were having a difficult time keeping maintained. They went in and cleaned that all out and put in a low water use landscape area that is very attractive, very efficient for their area where they have a lot of wind. And so they're offering rebates to their customers. Let's go down. Next slide, please. Kind of showing them installing the MP rotator heads. They have a lot of constant wind there, so they were challenged with trying to find a head that would withstand the Palouse winds. Next slide. Here's an example of a customer's landscaping where they pulled out their turf. Looks pretty bad. Put in a lot of rock and minimal landscaping. You'll notice the rain barrel there. And they saw an annual household savings of about 9,300 gallons over the season. So significant reduction, and it paid for itself in just a couple of years. Next slide, please. Where are we at for time on this, Dan?
I think we're pretty well there, Terry.
All right. Well, instead of getting into some of these other things where we have parking strips and buffers, we'll just go ahead and open it up for any other questions. And thank you, folks, for allowing us to present to you today. And we hope that you've heard what we've said and you'll take this to heart and start working on some water conservation of your own.